This is Mr. Wesley, and today we are doing what we did in an earlier video in this series. We are stepping outside the immediate pain of your specific situation and running a thought experiment. Not because thought experiments are an escape from reality, but because they are sometimes the most direct possible route into it. Because the right thought experiment, followed honestly wherever it leads, reveals things about the structure of the world you are living in that the daily texture of that world makes almost impossible to see clearly from the inside. The thought experiment today is this. What if the default custody arrangement in a divorce involving children was reversed? What if, instead of the system we have, in which the mother is awarded primary physical custody in the substantial majority of contested cases, in which the father is typically positioned as the secondary residential parent, in which the burden of demonstrating fitness for primary custody falls differently and more heavily on fathers than on mothers? What if, instead of that system, the default assumption was reversed? What if fathers received primary custody by default? What if the mother was the party who had to demonstrate fitness for primary residential parenting? What if the children lived primarily with the father and the mother had scheduled visitation on the terms that are currently standard for non-custodial fathers? I want you to run that scenario in your mind before we go any further. Not as a fantasy and not as a revenge scenario. Both of those responses would miss the point of the experiment entirely as a genuine and honest thought experiment. Hold the reversal in your mind and follow it wherever it honestly leads. What would the cultural response be? Stay with me, because in a few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what the research says about custody outcomes in the current system, what the thought experiment reveals when it is followed honestly to its conclusions, and what the specific implications of that revelation are for the men in this room who are either currently navigating a custody situation, or who are approaching one, or who have been through one, and are still carrying the specific and heavy weight of what it costs them. There is one specific thing the thought experiment reveals about the structure of the family court system that I want to make sure lands clearly before this video ends. Not as a grievance, not as an argument for a specific legal reform, but as a piece of information about the world you are navigating that you deserve to have accurately and honestly. But first you need to understand why the thought experiment is the right tool for this specific conversation. Because without that understanding, the experiment can be misread as something much cheaper than what it actually is. I am Mr. Wesley. I have spent years working alongside men who were navigating the family court system in the context of divorce and custody. Men who had been present and involved fathers across the years of their marriages, and who found, when those marriages ended, that the legal system they were entering had assumptions built into its structure that did not account for their experience as fathers or their fitness as primary caregivers in a way that the equivalent assumptions about mothers were applied. Men who discovered that the burden of proof in a custody proceeding is not symmetrically distributed between the parties, and that the default assumptions of the system favor one party in ways that are rarely named with the specificity they deserve. This is Relational Insights, and this is the thought experiment that names them. Let me set the experiment up with the data it requires to be properly grounded. The custody data in the United States and across most Western legal jurisdictions is consistent and has been consistent for decades. Mothers receive primary physical custody, defined as the children residing primarily with one parent, in approximately 65 to 70% of custody cases. In the remaining cases, joint physical custody is awarded in a growing proportion, a trend that has been moving in the direction of more equal arrangements over the last 20 years in response to advocacy and legislative reform in several states. With sole father custody accounting for a small fraction of the total, these numbers have been improving from the perspective of fathers who want equal access to their children. The trend is real, and it matters. But the baseline from which that improvement is moving is a baseline of significant asymmetry, and the forces that produce that asymmetry, the assumptions built into the legal culture of family court, the default presumptions that operate even in jurisdictions that have formally adopted equal parenting as the stated standard, the social and evaluative frameworks that family court professionals bring to custody assessments, those forces are more durable and more deeply embedded than the legislative changes that have formally addressed them. What does the data tell us about why the asymmetry exists? The explanations offered are several, and they are not all equivalent in their validity. The most commonly offered explanation is historical role division. The argument that mothers have typically been the primary caregivers during the marriage and that custody arrangements following divorce should reflect the primary caregiving reality of the intact family. This explanation has genuine validity in cases where the role division it describes is accurate. In marriages where the mother was the primary hands-on parent across the years of the children's lives, and the father was primarily a financial provider, a custody arrangement that reflects that reality has a coherent rationale the child's established primary attachment relationship is being preserved. The problem with this explanation, and the problem that the thought experiment is designed to make visible, is that it is applied as a presumption rather than as a case-specific finding. It is applied to families where the described role division was not the reality. It is applied to fathers who were equally or primarily involved in the hands-on work of parenting across the years of the marriage, and who find, when the marriage ends, that their demonstrated parenting involvement does not produce the presumption of fitness for primary custody that the equivalent involvement would produce in a mother. The explanation that was developed to account for the historical majority case has become the default framework that is applied to cases it does not accurately describe, and the men for whom it does not accurately describe their situation have no default presumption in their favor to counterbalance the one that is working against them. Now let me run the thought experiment in full. We reverse the default. Fathers receive primary physical custody by assumption. Mothers have scheduled visitation. Every other weekend, one evening per week. The standard non-custodial arrangement that has been the default for fathers in the existing system. The mother who wants more time with her children has to make the case for it through the legal process. The evaluations, the parenting assessments, the judicial discretion, all of it is now being applied to the question of whether the mother has demonstrated sufficient fitness to warrant a modification of the default that favors the father. What happens? The first thing that happens, and the most immediate, is a cultural response of a magnitude and an urgency that the equivalent response to the existing system has never produced. The assumption that fathers receive primary custody by default would be identified, immediately and loudly, and from every major cultural and political platform, as an injustice of the first order. Child welfare advocates would argue that separating children from their primary attachment figures, their mothers, in the majority of cases where the existing role division has been along traditional lines, is harmful to children's development and emotionally devastating to the mothers who have organized their lives around their parenting role. Women's advocacy organizations would identify the reversal as a fundamental violation of mothers' rights, and would mobilize with the full resources available to well-organized advocacy movements. Legislative reform would be on the agenda of every state legislature in the country within a cycle or two. The cultural conversation would be saturated with the stories of mothers who had lost primary access to their children through a legal system whose default assumptions worked against them. I want you to sit with that response for a moment. Not with bitterness, with the specific analytical attention the thought experiment is designed to produce, because the response I have just described is the appropriate response to a legal system whose default assumptions work against one class of parents without case-specific justification. It is the appropriate response to an arrangement that separates parents from their children on the basis of a presumption rather than a finding. It is the appropriate response to a burden of proof that falls asymmetrically on one party rather than both. It is also the response that the existing system, the one that produces the outcomes in the opposite direction, has largely not generated at the same scale or with the same cultural and political urgency. And the gap between the response that the reverse system would produce and the response that the existing system has produced is the gap the thought experiment is designed to make visible. What does that gap reveal? It reveals that the cultural and legal frameworks around custody operate with a default assumption about the relative importance of each parent's relationship with the child that is not stated explicitly, but that is embedded in the structure of the system and its outcomes. The assumption is not that both parents' relationships with the child are equally important, and that the post-divorce arrangement should be designed to preserve both relationships as fully as possible. The assumption, revealed by the outcomes the system produces and by the imagined response to its reversal, is that the mother's primary relationship with the child is the relationship whose preservation is the organizing principle of the custody determination, and that the father's relationship, while acknowledged as valuable, is the relationship whose parameters are set by what remains after the mother's primary relationship has been accommodated. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a deliberate injustice designed by people who wanted to harm fathers. It is the outcome of a legal culture that developed its assumptions about parenting and custody in a specific historical context, one in which the role divisions I described earlier were more universal than they are today, and in which the primary caregiver presumption accurately described the majority of cases, and that has not updated those assumptions with sufficient speed or sufficient completeness to account for the changed reality of parenting roles in the families that are coming through the system today. But the fact that it is not a conspiracy does not mean it is not an asymmetry. And the fact that the asymmetry was not designed to harm fathers does not mean it does not harm fathers. The harm is real. The fathers who have lost primary access to their children through a legal process that applied a default presumption to their situation that did not accurately reflect the parenting reality of their intact marriage are real men experiencing real losses that the cultural conversation has largely not made room to acknowledge as the injustices they are. I want to stay here with you for a moment because I know that for a significant number of the men in this room, this is not an abstract thought experiment. It is a description of something that happened to you, something you went through and are still going through, something that changed the texture of your daily life in a way that is more continuous and more relentless than almost any other consequence of the divorce. The specific daily absence of your children, the reduced access to the ordinary moments of their growing up, the experience of being a father whose relationship with his own children is now scheduled and bounded, and subject to the permissions and preferences of a legal arrangement that you did not choose and that does not reflect the father you actually were and are. I want to acknowledge that directly and without qualification. The loss of primary access to your children is one of the heaviest things a man can carry. It is not a paperwork loss, or a financial loss, or the kind of loss that has a recovery trajectory that is visible and navigable. It is a daily and ongoing and specifically human loss. The loss of the ordinary, the mundane, the unremarkable moments of a child's daily life that turn out, when they are gone, to be the substance of what fatherhood actually is. The school morning, the dinner table, the bedtime that is both tedious and irreplaceable. The specific and daily knowing of who your child is and how they are right now, rather than the periodic and scheduled knowing of a man whose access to his children is bounded by an arrangement he did not design. That loss deserves to be acknowledged as a loss. Not managed, not minimized, not explained away with references to the children's best interests in a way that treats your interest in your children as something less than fundamental. Your relationship with your children is a fundamental human relationship. The loss of primary access to it is a fundamental human loss. And the fact that the legal system produced that loss through a process that applied default assumptions rather than case-specific findings to your specific situation, a situation that may not have accurately reflected the default assumptions that were applied to it, is a specific and real injustice that the thought experiment is designed to make visible as such. Now let me give you something more useful than the acknowledgement of the injustice, because acknowledgement without a framework for navigating the actual situation you are in is only half a conversation. Here is what the research on post-divorce fathering tells us about what actually matters for the long-term outcomes of fathers who have experienced the specific loss of primary custody. What the men who navigate it most successfully do that is meaningfully different from the men who are most damaged by it. The first thing is the quality rather than the quantity focus. The research on children's outcomes in post-divorce, shared parenting arrangements consistently shows that the quality of the father's engagement during his parenting time has a significantly larger effect on children's long-term outcomes than the quantity of that time per se. This is not an argument that quantity does not matter. It does, and the fight for more equitable custody arrangements is worth fighting both for fathers and for children. But it is a finding that the father who uses the parenting time he has with full presence and full intentionality, who is genuinely, specifically, and completely available to his children during the time they are with him, rather than managing them from a distance while continuing to process his own grief and anger about the arrangement, is the father whose children carry the most of him with them when they are not physically present. The second thing is the consistency of non-residential engagement. The research is unambiguous that children's outcomes are significantly better when the non-residential father maintains consistent and reliable engagement with the child's daily life, even when that engagement does not involve physical presence. Consistent communication, genuine interest in the child's school and social and emotional life, engagement with the people and the experiences that constitute the child's world when they are not with the father. The father who is present in his children's lives in this continuous sense, even across the separation of a custody arrangement that limits his physical access, is the father whose relationship with his children survives and grows across the years of the arrangement in a way that the father who retreats between his scheduled parenting time cannot match. The third thing is the protection of the child from the conflict. This one is the hardest for men who are carrying the specific and justified grievance of a custody arrangement they experienced as unjust. The research on this is among the most consistent and the most emphatic in the entire literature on post-divorce outcomes for children. The single most damaging thing a post-divorce family structure can do to a child's long-term psychological health is to expose them to ongoing conflict between their parents about the custody arrangement, the divorce, or each other. Not the custody arrangement itself, the conflict around it. A child can adapt to a wide range of custody arrangements if the adults around them manage those arrangements without making the child the arena for their unresolved conflict. The father who protects his children from his conflict with their mother who does not speak critically of their mother in their presence, who does not use them as messengers or as intelligence sources about the other household, who manages his own justified anger and grief in spaces that are not the spaces his children inhabit, is the father who is doing the most important thing it is possible to do for his children in the specific situation he is in. And he is the father who, across the years of the arrangement, builds and maintains the kind of relationship with his children that cannot be reduced by the parameters of any custody order. The fourth thing is the investment in the legal trajectory. The legal landscape around custody is changing. The trend toward more equal parenting arrangements is real, it is documented, and it is accelerating in response to advocacy, legislative reform, and an accumulating body of research on the value of both parents' active involvement in children's lives post-divorce. The father who engages with that trajectory, who documents his parenting involvement meticulously, who works with legal counsel, who specializes in fathers' rights, and understands the specific evidentiary standards that support modifications toward more equal arrangements, who approaches the legal process with the patience and the strategic clarity of a man playing a long game, rather than the reactive urgency of a man who is processing his grief through his legal strategy, is the father who is most likely to see the parameters of his custody arrangement improve over time. The thought experiment I have walked you through today is not designed to leave you in the grievance of what the system produced. It is designed to give you something more useful than that, an accurate understanding of the structural asymmetry you navigated, which is different from the inaccurate understanding that positions the outcome of your custody case as a finding about your fitness as a father. The outcome of your custody case was shaped by default assumptions that the system applied to your situation. Those assumptions are not a verdict on who you are as a father. They are the product of a legal culture that has not yet fully updated its default presumptions to reflect the parenting reality of the modern families coming through it. You know who you are as a father. Your children know it too. And the work of being the father you are, with full presence, consistent engagement, protection of your children from the conflict, and patient investment in the legal trajectory, is the work that the thought experiment ultimately points toward, not because it is fair, it is not fair, but because your children's experience of their father is the outcome that matters most, and that is most within your control regardless of what the custody order says. The family court system was not built with your experience as the primary reference point. The thought experiment makes that visible. What you do with that visibility, how you carry it into the daily work of being a father in the specific and constrained situation the system produced, is the question that determines what your children carry of you when they are grown. Drop a comment. Men, what has been the hardest part of maintaining your relationship with your children inside a custody arrangement that limited your access, and what has worked for you in terms of staying genuinely present in their lives across that limitation? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the hidden structures of marriage, divorce, and fatherhood, with the honesty and the precision that finally gives men the framework their experience actually deserves, rather than the one the system was built around.